I am here to discuss what will happen in our cities and what's already happening, actually, all around the world, even here in Finland, when we get not only new kinds of cars, but also other forms of transportation that are mostly electric, such as these. This here is an electric skateboard. It's called the boosted board, and it's what I'm working on currently. I'd love to tell you a little bit more about it. So Boosted is a company based in California in Mountain View, and we're about 50 people now. And we make fun, fast, and simple transportation for everyone. And right now, what you can see is the creation by our engineering team, which is a longboard, except it's not quite the normal kind of longboard that you might see on the streets. It's got a battery up here, and it's got two motors down here, and a motor controller over here. And there's a whole bunch of software that lets you control it using a handheld remote that operates over Bluetooth. So when I press down on the trigger, maybe some of you can see it or hear it. These powerful motors will move the wheels. You can go forward and also brake, which is important. And one of the interesting things when we first started making these was that I think a lot of people thought about them as toys. And maybe some of us did too. I got mine thinking that it was mostly for recreation. But pretty quickly what I noticed that when I was on my booster board, I was able to get places a lot quicker than I was using my car, getting on the bus, even using my bike. I love bikes. And what I was most surprised by was that I ended up leaving my bike at home and starting to go to work using my board. And it took me a little while to realize that what was going on was not only did I have more fun, but I was getting there a lot faster, especially in a city like San Francisco, which has lots and lots of hills. It's really useful to have electric power around. So, the other interesting thing that I noticed was I didn't really have to wait the entire time that I was spending doing my commute to work. I was actually moving. I wasn't waiting for a bus. I certainly wasn't driving around trying to look for parking like I used to. And I didn't even really need to prepare or, for instance, lock a bike, because I could just throw this thing on the ground and go. And when I was ready, when I arrived at my office or at the gym, the yoga parlor where I go to yoga sometimes, I could just pick up the board and walk in and pick it up and go with me. So I was actually not only able to move places faster while I was in motion, but I was cutting out that unproductive time from the beginning and end of my commute. And overall, that results in a lot of time saved. So I got interested in this, and we made some studies, actually in different cities around the world. And the results you can see here. You can usually, in fact, always in our studies, get from a residential address to some office or another place in the city the quickest using one of these vehicles. And if you think a little bit, if you step back, like I have when I have been working as an entrepreneur in residence at True Ventures and thinking about what would I do next over the last 3 years, I wanted to do something that I felt mattered globally. And when you look at the world from space, like I was flipping around looking at these beautiful NASA photos one day on my computer, there were two things that stand out if you look at the way the Earth has changed over the last few decades. The first one is there are a lot more lights when it's dark. And almost all of those lights are cities. There's just more cities, and the cities are getting bigger. The other thing that you notice, which maybe isn't quite as exciting, actually quite terrifying, is that the ice caps are going away. as we all know. And so, if you look at the sociological side of this aspect, if that's the naturalist side of what you see here is what I think is the greatest megatrend right now in society, which is the growth of cities. All those red dots that are growing around the world in this animation are urban population everywhere in the world. What's basically happening is that most of us already live in cities. Over half of the world's population in 2007, I think, was the point when it was over 50% globally had moved to cities. And by 2030, in many developed countries, it's going to be over 90%. So there are a lot more of us, and we are living closer together. The congruent thing that's been going on, which is a little bit in conflict with this growth in these dense urban areas, is obvious also. We all can see it around us. There are just a lot more cars. And if you look at the developing countries, especially China, there are a lot more cars. And most of those cars, as you know, don't get used all the time. They sit around unused, actually most of their time. And what it results in is what Diane was just talking about, which is this increase in traffic and congestion that they're solving over at Waze and Google and other places. And it's massive. It's just incredible. In San Francisco, 30% of the traffic is people looking for parking. 30%, that's insane. And that's not even the worst city in the world. There are much worse places in San Francisco. The other interesting thing is that if you look at the traffic speed in these cities, it hasn't really gotten any faster since the days of the horse and the cart. We've got all these great new cars, but the average speed in congested areas like central London or Manhattan isn't much faster than walking distance or walking speed. And we all know what it looks like most of the time. It looks something like this. Now, interestingly, alongside of all these things, growth in private car ownership, growth in traffic congestion, growth in cities, melting of the polar ice cap, something else has been going on. For the first time in history since the invention of the automobile, car ownership is actually declining in the United States now, especially among the young people who are just getting old enough to drive. They're no longer getting driver licenses at the rate that they used to, and they're no longer buying cars at the rate that they're used to. And what's interesting at the same time is we have this dramatic growth in things like ride-sharing services, Uber and Lyft, obviously, but also sharing of your private cars. This map here is a screen grab from my iPhone, and I actually have my car has been on this service. It's called Getaround. This is a San Francisco map of the Getaround cars. So basically private people doing something similar to what in Helsinki you might know as City Car Club, letting other people use their car, basically Airbnb for cars. And it's incredible just how many of the cars in San Francisco now are available with just the tap of a button for me to unlock the door, get in and drive. I use it every week. It's actually faster for me to get a get-around car than to walk around the corner halfway around the block and to my own car parking space and take my own car. And I see this. This is a picture of San Francisco. This is actually the neighborhood I live in. It's called Hayes Valley. And this picture shows what it used to look like before the earthquake in 1989. Loma Prieta. There was a double-decker freeway called the Central Freeway that basically just went right through the neighborhood. But, as some of you might remember, what happened in that earthquake was that double-decker freeway collapsed dramatically. And the city never rebuilt it. There just wasn't enough money. There was so much damage that they couldn't afford to rebuild it. And this is a picture of that same place where that freeway used to run. And I walk by here every day. This is now called Precious Green. And it's become this wonderful, one of the most interesting urban areas in all of San Francisco, right outside my doorstep, where people show movies outdoors at night. There's an ice cream parlor. There's a beer garden. There's a coffee shop. There's a park where my kids play. And that very same place used to be a double-decker freeway, which my kids don't remember, but I still do. I used to drive on that same freeway. And that's inspiring. Sometimes really horrible things like earthquakes can actually be the best things to happen to a city. And thinking about that, what could be of that magnitude of a change? Earthquakes obviously are terrible, terrible events, but they really disrupt things. It's what we've been talking about today here on stage. This is just an example photo of self-driving cars, which are now becoming ubiquitous in the San Francisco traffic. There's Uber self-driving cars. There's tons of Google self-driving cars that ride all around our office and drive me crazy. My kids, there's classmates at school now in Palo Alto, their favorite pastime is to trap the little friendly Google self-driving cars into little cul-de-sacs and get them to sort of not be able to move. It's like the hobby of Palo Alto children nowadays, is to be really evil to the self-driving cars and try to get them to hit them. And so what it's all pointing at is that these things don't actually need to be parked. And so here's just a conceptual photo. This is from a San Francisco plan. You could totally remove street-side parking. And when I started thinking about that, I got really excited because what I see as a potential future, and here's one image, this is not by us, but something I just grabbed off the internet, is that we might end up in cities that look a lot more like the cities that we all prefer. Places like Assisi in Italy, which is probably one of my favorite cities in the world, where it's still in this medieval, where it's really not possible for you to drive, or if it's possible to drive a car, the cars drive very slowly. But there's this other additional thing that I'm curious about, which is whether we could actually take some of that technical innovation that's now happening in self-driving cars. It's things like electric drivetrains, connectivity to the internet, which is getting cheaper, autonomous features, and the sharing aspect. And what if we applied that to vehicles that operate in the bike lanes? And could it furthermore be that we could imagine bike lanes differently in the future, where perhaps they're no longer just for bikes that you pedal, but different kinds of lightweight vehicles, maybe vehicles like this one, and other ones that might look similar or be even more lightweight, that you can ride places that are safe, that are pretty fast, and above all, that are really fun. And might those be something that we might see more of in the future alongside of those self-driving cars that obviously never hit us because they're so friendly, even if you trap them, that we might end up with cities where people aren't just getting around sitting in cars, maybe plugging into VR headsets, but are interacting more with their environments and actually are present in what's happening around them, even though they're still getting around places faster than they used to. And that's what I'm working on right now, and I invite you to join me. This is something that I would say is potentially the greatest, the most exciting opportunity right now for applying things like big data, applying the kind of innovation that I know in radio technology, in just the software of sharing systems, is really being pioneered and has been pioneered for decades in Scandinavia, in Europe. There's so much better infrastructure in Europe than there is in America for a lot of this stuff to happen, that I would love to see more companies, more startups. Of course, I have a vested interest in Boosted. I think we're going to do great. But I just see this space needing more of these companies, especially here in Europe. And so I wanted to leave you guys with that thought. And if any of you have any ideas or maybe you're pitching your own companies, come talk to us. As was mentioned before I started this talk, not only do I work at Boosted as a head of product, but I also work at True Ventures with Tony Conrad, who's here as a partner at True. And we invest in hardware companies. And we're looking for these opportunities. So I look forward to meeting some of you guys later on today and tomorrow at the conference. Thanks very much.